Welcome to tonight's reading of Voices of a People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn and Anthony Arnove. First, just a few notes. Tonight's event will be broadcast on Democracy Now!, on Pacifica Radio, on WBAI 99.5 FM, on Free Speech TV, Alternative Radio, Link TV, and other independent media. The good news is that there is independent media in this city and around the country that is helping to break the sound barrier. I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now!, and it is wonderful to be here with Seven Stories Press, here to celebrate the publishing of Voices of a People's History of the United States and to introduce the star of this evening, though he would cringe at that word, Howard Zinn. Alice Walker said this about Howard: "What can I say that will in any way convey the love, respect, and admiration I feel for this unassuming hero who was my teacher and mentor, this radical historian and people-loving troublemaker, this man who stood with us and suffered with us. Howard Zinn was the best teacher I ever had and the funniest." The words of Alice Walker. Howard grew up in the slums of Brooklyn during the Depression. He said it was too organized to call them projects. At 17, he was a shipyard worker. By 21, an Air Force bombardier. After he bombed the French village with napalm, he went there to see what he had done and went to the bombed-out library and read accounts of what had happened and wondered how it was he hadn't questioned before what he was doing. He said it epitomized the stupidity of modern warfare and how the momentum of military machines carries armies on to do the most atrocious things that any rational person sitting down for 5 minutes and thinking about it would stop immediately. And then, years later, he was invited to speak at Hiroshima. He said he was planning to say that he was a bombardier, even though he didn't bomb Japan. He said he wanted to say, "I bombed people, innocent people, civilians, just as in Hiroshima." And then he said, describing that day in Hiroshima, when he got up to speak, he looked out at the people sitting there. "Suddenly something happened to my eyesight, my brain. I saw this blur of people who were blind with missing arms, missing legs, people whose skin was covered with sores. This was real. That's what these people look like. I looked out at them and I couldn't speak. In all the speaking I've ever done, nothing like that has ever happened to me. It was impossible. I just stood there. My voice choked up, and that was that." That is Howard Zinn, a historian with a heart, a person who is passionate about documenting what has taken place and bringing out the voices of those at the target end of the foreign policy of those in power in this country and around the world. After he got his PhD from Columbia, he went on to teach at Spelman, where he taught Alice Walker. He was a civil rights activist, jailed for his civil rights activism, and then for his anti-war protest. Howard Zinn went to Hanoi with Father Dan Berrigan, where he went to negotiate the release of U.S. POWs, perhaps best known for his book, A People's History of the United States, published in 1980. This book has broken every formula for success. It has sold now more than 1 million copies, each year selling more copies than the year before. This turns This has turned the publishing formulas on their heads. But is that any surprise? After all, we're talking about Howard Zinn, who's turned the writing of history on its head, who has taught us what it means to go back and meticulously, carefully, passionately bring back the voices of those, not the generals, not the presidents, not the war makers, but those who every day have worked to build this country and countries around the world who are not documented. That's who Howard Zinn gives voice to. That's why people's history of the United States only grows more popular every day. That's why we're here tonight to celebrate the companion volume that Howard Zinn and Anthony Arnove have been working on for years, Voices of a People's History of the United States. On September 11, 2001, after that moment, the next day, we were trying to think, who could we turn to on Democracy Now? Who could speak about what was happening to all of us? And I couldn't think of a better person to call than Howard. And we called him up, and he came on the radio and said, as we were listening to the emergency workers and the neighbors hammering those pallets, the non-stop hammering all day. The only thing worse was when that hammering stopped because there were no bodies to bring out. Howard said, let the paramedics and the firefighters be our model for a response. Those heroes who are trying to save people, not those who will respond by killing. That's why it's so important to celebrate Howard Zinn tonight and why it's such an honor to be able to introduce him. Howard Zinn is a remarkable historian, a vivid writer, but most importantly, he is a hell of a nice guy, a true gentleman, Howard Zinn.
Thank you, Amy. I'm glad I didn't hear everything you said. It's an honor to be introduced by Amy Goodman. You probably know what would we do without her in Democracy Now? You know, really. I'd like to thank a few people who had so much to do with gathering all of you together and arranging and organizing all this. Of course, I want to thank the Ethical Culture Society of New York for allowing us in. And the people of Seven Stories Press, which not only published my book, but I don't know, they even publish other books. And they worked very hard in organizing this. You know, Dan Simon, the sort of editor, I don't think he wants to be called editor-in-chief, but he's the editor of Seven Stories Press. There are others. But he's the one who had the most to do with all of this. And several other people from Seven Stories Press, have worked very hard on this. Jesse Kindig and Ruth Weiner, who obviously have a lot of friends in this audience. But they're the unsung people. And Brenda Coughlin, who indispensable. I won't say anything more about her. You won't see her. She's invisible, but she does important things. Like she will hold up her hand to the speakers when they get too close to the microphone. What could be more important? Okay. Thank Joey Fox, who just helped me and Anthony a lot. And of course, I have to thank Anthony Arnove simply because he's here and listening. I guess I should tell you a little about how this came about. Tell you why you're here, although I guess no one knows better than you why you are here. How can I tell you why you are here? But I'll tell you how this came to pass. And that is Dan Simon and Anthony Arnove and I, in an order which I can't reveal, got together and decided that this book, A People's History of the United States, was okay. And that, by the way, published by HarperCollins, owned by Murdoch. I've always been grateful to him. And we got together and decided that in the people's history of the United States, what seemed to be the most interesting parts were the sort of little nuggets of other people's statements, not my words, and this is embarrassing when I thought of it, but not my words, but the words of other people, the words of fugitive slaves, of rebellious women, of working people, of socialists and anti-war activists, of dissidents of all kinds. So we had little nuggets of those words in people's history, and we decided that's not enough, and we should expand that and gather all sorts of voices of dissent, starting with the very beginning, and coming up to as close as we could to the present day, and so out of that, came this project in this rather formidable book, Voices of a People's History of the United States. So that's the origin of this, and so we decided that, and Seven Stories Press, was agreed to sort of work on this and organize this, and with Anthony and Brenda and other people, and the idea was to get some artists in New York, and this is what we did. We have assembled a wonderful bunch of artists who will read some of the selections from this book, and here they are. Wally Shawn. Leslie Silva. Brian Jones. John Sayles. Sarah Jones. Paul Robeson Jr., Lily Taylor. And Anthony Arnove, who up to this point has been only a name to you, will walk across here and take his seat over there, and he and I will take turns introducing the readings.
In recent years, the idealized, romanticized picture of Columbus has begun to be reconsidered. The evidence for this revised view comes mainly from Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a contemporary of Columbus and who himself witnessed the scenes on Hispaniola, which he describes in the following passages.
The Indies were discovered in the year 1492. 49 years have passed since the first settlers penetrated the land, the first being the large and most happy isle called Hispaniola, perhaps the most densely populated place in the world. There must be close to 200 leagues of land, and all discovered was a beehive of people, as though God had crowded into these lands the vast majority of mankind. And of all the infinite universe of humanity, these people are the most guileless, the most devoid of wickedness and duplicity, the most obedient and faithful to their native masters and to the Spanish Christians whom they serve. And because they are so weak and complaisant, they are less able to endure heavy labor and soon die of no matter what malady. They are also a poor people, for they not only possess little, but have no desire to possess worldly goods. They are generally naked, with only their pudenda covered somewhat, and sleep on a kind of matting, or else in a suspended net called hamacas. They are very clean in their persons, with alert, intelligent minds, docile, and open to doctrine, very apt to receive our holy Catholic faith, to be endowed with virtuous customs and behave in a godly fashion. Yet, into this sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards who behaved like ravening wild beasts, like wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starving for many days, and to such a degree that this island of Hispaniola, having a population that I estimated to be more than 3 millions, has, after 40 years, a population of barely 200 persons. Their reason for killing such an infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold and to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time and thus rise to a high estate disproportionate to their merits. These lands are so rich and felicitous, the native people so meek and patient, so easy to subject, that our Spaniards have no more consideration to them than beasts. No, for thanks be to God, they have treated beasts with some respect. I should say, instead, like excrement on the public squares. The Indians began to seek ways to throw the Christians out of their lands and took up arms, but their weapons are very weak and of little service in offense and still less in defense. The Christians, with their horses and swords and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties amongst them, and spared neither the children, nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor women in childbed, not only stabbing and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces, as if dealing with sheep in a slaughterhouse. They made low, wide gallows, on which the hanged victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing them up in lots of 13, in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, then setting burning wood at their feet, and thus burned them alive. When tied to the stake, a very important noble, the cacique Hatue, was told by a Franciscan friar about the God of the Christians and the Articles of Faith, and what he could do in the brief time that remained to him in order to be saved and go to heaven. The cacique was told if he did not adopt the Christian faith, he would go to the inferno where he would suffer eternal torment. He asked the friar if Christians, on the other hand, went to heaven. When told that they did, he said he would prefer to go to hell.
One of the great figures of early native resistance to colonization was Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader who earned a reputation by his skills in fighting white settlers and militias in the Midwest. Here he speaks to a different tribe, the Osage.
Brothers, we all belong to one family. We are all children of the Great Spirit. We walk in the same path, slake our thirst at the same spring, and now affairs of the greatest concern lead us to smoke the pipe around the same council fire. Brothers, we are friends. We must assist each other to bear our burdens. The blood of many of our fathers and brothers has run like water on the ground to satisfy the avarice of the white men. We ourselves are threatened with a great evil. Nothing will pacify them but the destruction of all red men. Brothers, when the white men first set foot on our grounds, they were hungry. They had no place on which to spread their blankets or to kindle their fires. They were feeble. They could do nothing for themselves. Our Father commiserated their distress and shared freely with them whatever the Great Spirit had given his red children. They gave them food when hungry, medicine when sick, spread skins for them to sleep on, and gave them grounds that they might hunt and raise corn. Brothers, the white people are like poisonous serpents. When chilled, they are feeble and harmless, but invigorate them with warmth, and they sting their benefactors to death. The white people came among us feeble, and now we have made them strong. They wish to kill us or drive us back as they would wolves and panthers. Brothers, the white men are not friends to the Indians. At first, they only asked for land and sufficient for a wigwam. Now, nothing will satisfy them but the whole of our hunting grounds from the rising to the setting sun. Brothers, who are white people that we should fear them? They cannot run fast and are good marks to shoot at. They are only men. Their fathers, our fathers, have killed many of them. Brothers, the Great Spirit is angry with our enemies. He speaks in thunder, and the earth swallows up villages and drinks up the Mississippi. The great waters will cover their lowlands. Their corn cannot grow, and the Spirit will sweep those who escape to the hills from the earth with his terrible breath. Brothers, we must be united. We must smoke the same pipe. We must fight each other's battles, and more than all, we must love the Great Spirit. He is for us. He will destroy our enemies and make all his red children happy.
When Boston capitalists, making use of the new canal system, began building textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts in the early 19th century, they recruited young women from rural New England as their labor force. They assumed these girls would be docile and easily managed. Instead, the young women in Lowell mills formed reading circles, organized to demand their rights as laborers and as women, and agitated for better workplace conditions. They printed leaflets and published their own newspaper, the Lowell Offering. Here, Harriet Hanson Robinson, who started work in the mills when she was only 10 years old, recounts a turnout or strike of the Lowell women.
At the time, The Lowell cotton mills were started. The factory girl was the lowest among women. In England, and in France particularly, great injustice had been done to her real character. She was represented as subjected to influences that could not fail to destroy her purity and self-respect. In the eyes of her overseer, she was but a brute, a slave to be beaten, pinched, and pushed about. One of the first strikes of the cotton factory operatives that ever took place in this country was that in Lowell in October 1836. When it was announced that wages were to be cut down, great indignation was felt, and it was decided to strike en masse. This was done. The mills were shut down, and the girls went in procession from their several corporations to the Grove on Chapel Hill and listened to incendiary speeches from early labor reformers. One of the girls stood on a pump and gave vent to the feelings of her companions in a neat speech, declaring that it was their duty to resist all attempts at cutting down the wages. This was the first time a woman had spoken in public in Lowell, and the event caused surprise and consternation among her audience. Cutting down the wages was not their only grievance, nor the only cause of this strike. Hitherto, the corporations had paid 25 cents a week towards the board of each operative, and now it was their purpose to have the girls pay the sum. And this, in addition to the cut in wages, would make a difference of at least $1 a week. It was estimated that as many as 1,200 or 1,500 girls turned out and walked in procession through the streets. My own recollection of this first strike, or turnout as it was called, is very vivid. I worked in a lower room where I had heard the proposed strike fully, if not vehemently, discussed. I had been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempt at oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally I took sides with the strikers. When the day came on which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper room started first, and so many of them left that our mill was at once shut down. Then when the girls in my room stood irresolute, uncertain what to do, asking each other, "Would you, or shall we turn out?" and not one of them having the courage to lead off, I, who began to think they would not go out after all their talk, became impatient and started on ahead, saying with childish bravado, "I don't care what you do. I am going to turn out whether anyone else does or not." And I marched out and was followed by the others. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I have ever been at any success I may have ever achieved.
That was great. July 4th is held up as a day to celebrate the struggle for freedom and independence. But the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, himself a former slave and the editor of the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, dared to challenge the exaltation of the holiday. Here is part of his address to the Rochester, New York Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in 1852.
Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, he who could address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way for me. It is true that I've often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence, but neither their familiar faces nor the perfect gauge I think I have of Corinthian Hall seems to free me from embarrassment. Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I asked to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light, and my burden easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to the claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, and prosperity bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is the 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth more guilty of practices so shocking and bloody as are the people of the United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you've found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without rival.
The most underreported story of the Civil War is the class conflict within the Confederate States. In April 1863, in Richmond, Virginia, there was a bread riot. That summer, draft riots occurred in various southern cities. In September, another bread riot broke out in Mobile, Alabama. Acts of resistance took place not only among soldiers, but also among women facing hardship while men were on the front lines. This article, from a newspaper in Columbus, Georgia, illustrates the ferment in the South during the war.
upon poor women and children, upon soldiers who are toiling and bleeding for liberty, upon salaried men who have not the time or who have no desire to speculate, the whole weight of this fearful struggle falls. Men of wealth, who are hoarding thousands, put up the piteous cry of exorbitant rates, more bitterly than ever just after increasing the prices 1,000-fold. While upon ragged, blood-drenched soldiers, upon weary, despairing, heartsick women, and those whose only dependence is a pitiful yearly sum, must be made to bitterly suffer. Non-producers alone feel the war. Others can meet high rates with the same. Those who speculate not must shift as best they can. What matters life or death, so avarice can be gratified? What is honor unattended by wealth? What is liberty unless money can be hoarded by millions? What if the country be ruined, its women ravished, its homes desolated, its altars violated, and freedom forever perish? What matters all, so the almighty dollar may be amassed in piles? What care men of the present day whether their country sinks, so property may be secured, and the price at which liberty is bought rests as light as possible upon their patriotic shoulders? That's right. Pile up wealth. No matter whether bread be drawn from the mouth of the soldier's orphan or the one-armed, one-limbed hero who hungry walks your streets. Take every dollar you can, pay out as little as possible, deprive your noble warriors of every comfort and luxury, increase in every way the necessaries of life, make everybody but yourself and non-producers bear the taxes of the war. But be very careful to parade everything you give before the public. Talk boldly on the street corners of your love of country. Be a grand home general. And when the war is over, point to your princely palace and its magnificent surroundings and exclaim with pompous swell, "These are the results of my patriotism."
In the brief period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, when the freed slaves could vote, Henry McNeil Turner was elected as a representative to the Georgia State Legislature, which soon after expelled him and other black members. Here he addresses the members of the legislature.
The Anglo-Saxon race, sir, is the most surprising one. No man has ever been more deceived in that race than I have been for the last 3 weeks. I was not aware that there was in the character of that race so much cowardice. The treachery which has been exhibited by gentlemen belonging to that race has shaken my confidence in it more than anything that has come under my observation from the day of my birth. What is the question at issue? Why, sir, this assembly today is discussing and deliberating on a judgment. There is not a cherubim that sits around God's eternal throne today that would not tremble, even were an order issued by the Supreme God himself to come down here and sit in judgment on my manhood. Gentlemen, you may look at this question in whatever light you choose. and with just as much indifference as you may think proper to assume. But I will tell you, sir, that this is a question which will not die today. This event shall be remembered by posterity for ages yet to come, and while the sun shall continue to climb the hills of heaven. Whose legislature is this? Is it a white man's legislature? Or is it a black man's legislature? Who voted for the Constitutional Convention in obedience to the mandate of the Congress of the United States? Who first rallied around the standard of Reconstruction? Who set the ball of loyalty rolling in the state of Georgia? And whose voice was heard on the hills and in the valleys of this state? It was the voice of the brawny-armed Negro with the few humanitarian-hearted white men who came to our assistance. I claim the honor, sir, of having been the instrument of convincing hundreds, yea, thousands of white men, that to reconstruct under the measures of the United States Congress was the safest and best course for the interest of the state. There are persons in this legislature today who are ready to spit their poison in my face, while they themselves opposed with all their power the ratification of this Constitution. They question my right to a seat in this body to represent the people whose legal votes elected me. This objection, sir, is an unheard of monopoly of power. No analogy can be found for it, except it be the case of a man who should go into my house, take possession of my wife and children, and then tell me to walk out. I stand very much in the position of a criminal before your bar, because I dare to be the exponent of the views of those who sent me here. Or in other words, we are told that if black men want to speak, they must speak through white trumpets. If black men want their sentiments expressed, they must be adulterated and sent through white messengers who will quibble and equivocate and evade. If this not be done, then the black men have committed an outrage, and their representatives must be denied the right to represent their constituents. The great question, sir, is this: am I a man? If I am such, I claim the rights of a man. Am I not a man because I happen to be of a darker hue than the honorable gentlemen around me?
In November 1872, Susan B. Anthony was one of 14 women who defied the law to cast a ballot in the presidential election. She was arrested for knowingly voting without having a lawful right to vote, and on June 18, 1873, was found guilty. The next day, when her lawyer appealed the verdict, she addressed the court in response to a question from the judge, Ward Hunt.
Has the prisoner anything to say why sentence shall not be pronounced?
Yes, Your Honor. I have many things to say. For in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. Robbed of the fundamental privilege of citizenship, I am degraded from the status of a citizen to that of a subject. And not only myself individually, but all of my sex are, by yours on a verdict, doomed to political subjection under this so-called Republican form of government.
The court cannot listen to a rehearsal of argument which the prisoner's counsel has already consumed 3 hours in presenting.
May it please your honor, I am not arguing the question, but simply stating the reasons why sentence cannot, in justice, be pronounced against me. Your denial of my citizens' right to vote is the denial of my right of consent as one of the governed, the denial of my right of representation as one of the taxed, the denial of my right to a trial by jury of my peers as an offender against the law. Therefore, the denial of my sacred right to life, liberty, property.
The court cannot allow the prisoner to go on.
But your honor will not deny me this one and only poor privilege of protest against this high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights.
The court must insist the prisoner has been tried according to the established forms of law.
Yes, your honor, but by forms of law all made by men, interpreted by men, administered by men, in favor of men, and against women. And hence your honor's ordered verdict of guilty against a United States citizen for the exercise of the citizen's right to vote, simply because that citizen was a woman and not a man. But yesterday, the same man-made forms of law declared it a crime punishable with a $1,000 fine and 6 months imprisonment to give a cup of cold water, a crust of bread, or a night's shelter to a panting fugitive tracking his way to Canada. And every man or woman in whose veins coursed a drop of human sympathy violated that wicked law, reckless of consequences, and was justified in doing so. As then the slaves who got the freedom had to take it over or under or through the unjust forms of law, precisely so now must women take it to get right to a voice in this government, and I have taken mine and mean to it every opportunity.
The court must insist the sentence of the court is that you pay a fine of $100 and the costs of the prosecution.
May it please your honor, I will never pay $1 for your unjust penalty. All the stock in trade I possess is a debt of $10,000 incurred by publishing my paper, The Revolution, the sole object of which was to educate all women to do precisely as I have done. Rebel against your man-made, unjust, unconstitutional forms of law which tax, fine, imprison, and hang women, while denying them the right of representation in the government. And I will work on with might and main to pay every dollar of that honest debt, but not a penny shall go to this unjust claim. And I shall earnestly and persistently continue to urge all women to the practical recognition of the old revolutionary maxim, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.
At the end of the 19th century, the United States became an overseas imperial power. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898, when it assumed control over Cuba, it annexed Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Samoa. It then began a long and bloody war to conquer the Philippines. The occupation of those islands has been cited by George Bush as a model for the occupation of Iraq. But at the time, it aroused indignation and opposition in the United States. Mark Twain is known as the great writer of novels, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer. Less known is that he was a leader of the anti-imperialist movement. He said, "I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." Here is his reaction to the massacre by an American Army regiment of some 600 men, women, and children on the southern island of the Philippines.
This incident burst upon the world last Friday in an official cablegram from the commander of our forces in the Philippines to our government in Washington. A tribe of Moros, dark-skinned savages, had fortified themselves in the bowl of an extinct crater not many miles from Jolo. And as they were hostiles and bitter against us because we have been trying for 8 years to take their liberties away from them, their presence was a menace. Our commander, General Leonard Wood, ordered a reconnaissance. It was found that the Moros numbered 600, counting women and children, that their crater bowl was in the summit of a peak 2,200 feet above sea level, and very difficult access for Christian troops and artillery. Our troops climbed a distance of some 300 feet by devious and difficult trails, and even took some artillery with them. Our soldiers numbered 540, assisted by a detachment of native constabulary in our pay, numbers not given, and a naval detachment, numbers not given. 600 men on our side, on the edge of the bowl, 600 men, women, and children in the bottom of the bowl. Depth of bowl, 50 feet. The battle began. It is officially called by that name. Our forces firing down into the crater with their artillery and their deadly small arms of precision. The savages furiously returning the fire, probably with brickbats, though this is merely a surmise of mine, as the weapons used by the savages are not nominated in the telegram. Heretofore, the Moros have used knives and clubs mostly, also ineffectual trade muskets when they had any. The completeness of the victory is established by this fact, that of the 600 Moros, not one was left alive. That of our 600 heroes, only 15 lost their lives. The official report quite properly extolled and magnified the heroism and gallantry of our troops and lamented the loss of the 15 who perished, by cable at $1.50 a word. In the great battles of the Civil War, only 10% of the forces engaged on the two sides were killed and wounded. 8 years ago, when the pathetic comedy called the Cuban War was played, we did not exterminate the Spanish, far from it. In each engagement, we left an average of only 2% of the enemy killed or crippled on the field. Contrast these things with the great statistics which have arrived from the Moro crater. We abolished the enemy utterly, leaving not even a baby alive to cry for its dead mother. One person among our 80 millions allowed himself the privilege of a public remark on this great occasion. Washington, March 10th, to Wood, Manila. I congratulate you and the officers and men of your command upon the brilliant feat of arms wherein you and they so well uphold the honor of the American flag. Signed, President Theodore Roosevelt. But yesterday's cable brought us more splendid news, which blazes with American and Christian glory like to the sun and the zenith. The death list is now 900. I was never so enthusiastically proud of the flag till now.
A Lithuanian immigrant, Emma Goldman was an anarchist and a feminist orator. She was an agitator, an organizer, and a fierce opponent of war. She was jailed many times for her speeches. After the outbreak of World War I in Europe, and before the entrance of the United States into the war, she spoke in San Francisco on the theme of patriotism.
What is patriotism? Is it love of one's birthplace, the place of childhood's recollections and hopes, dreams and aspirations? Leo Tolstoy, the greatest anti-patriot of our times, defines patriotism as the principle that will justify the training of wholesale murderers, a trade that requires better equipment for the exercise of man-killing than the making of such necessities of life as shoes, clothing, and houses, a trade that guarantees better returns and greater glory than that of the average working man. Indeed, conceit, arrogance, and egotism are the essentials of patriotism. Let me illustrate. Patriotism assumes that our globe is divided into little spots, each one surrounded by an iron gate. Those who have had the fortune of being born on some particular spot consider themselves better, nobler, grander, more intelligent than the living beings inhabiting any other spot. It is therefore the duty of everyone living on that chosen spot to fight, kill, and die in the attempt to impose his superiority upon all the others. The inhabitants of the other spots reason, in like manner, of course, with the result that, from early infancy, the mind of the child is poisoned with blood-curdling stories about the Germans, the French, the Italians, Russians, etc. When the child has reached manhood, he is thoroughly saturated with the belief that he is chosen by the Lord himself to defend his country against the attack or invasion of any foreigner. It is for that purpose that we are clamoring for a greater army and navy, more battleships and ammunition. We Americans claim to be peace-loving people. We hate bloodshed. We are opposed to violence. Yet we go into spasms of joy over the possibility of projecting dynamite bombs from flying machines upon helpless citizens. We are ready to hang, electrocute, or lynch anyone who, from economic necessity, will risk his own life in the attempt upon that of some industrial magnate. Yet our hearts swell with pride at the thought of America becoming the most powerful nation on earth, and that it will eventually plant her iron foot on the necks of all other nations. Such is the logic of patriotism. Thinking men and women the world over are beginning to realize that patriotism is too narrow and limited a conception to meet the necessities of our time. The centralization of power has brought into being an international feeling of solidarity among the oppressed nations of the world, a solidarity which represents a greater harmony of interests between the working man of America and his brothers abroad than between the American miner and his exploiting compatriot. A solidarity which fears not foreign invasion because it is bringing all the workers to the point when they will say to their masters, "Go and do your own killing. We have done it long enough for you." This solidarity is awakening the consciousness of even the soldiers, they too being flesh of the great human family. A solidarity that has proven infallible more than once during past struggles, and which has been the impetus inducing the Parisian soldiers during the Commune of 1871 to refuse to obey when ordered to shoot their brothers. It has given courage to men who mutinied on Russian warships during recent years. It will eventually bring about the uprising of all the oppressed and downtrodden against their international exploiters. When we have undermined the patriotic lie, we shall have cleared the path for that great structure wherein all nationalities shall be united into a universal brotherhood, a truly free society.
One of the most eloquent and uncompromising voices against war was that of Eugene Debs. At first an organizer of railroad workers, later a leader of the Socialist Party. On June 18, 1918, he spoke in Canton, Ohio, in defiance of the Espionage Act, which made it a crime to say anything that would obstruct recruitment into the armed forces. He was arrested, found guilty, and his sentence of 10 years was upheld by a unanimous Supreme Court. Here's the speech that led to his arrest.
Sam Johnson declared that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. He must have had the Wall Street gentry in mind, or at least their prototypes, for in every age it has been the tyrant, the oppressor, and the exploiter who has wrapped himself in the cloak of patriotism or religion, or both, to deceive and overawe the people. Every solitary one of these aristocratic conspirators and would-be murderers claims to be an arch-patriot. Every one of them insists that the war is being waged to make the world safe for democracy. What humbug! What rot! What false pretense! These autocrats, these tyrants, these red-handed robbers and murderers, the patriots. Well, the men who have the courage to stand face to face with them, speak the truth, and fight for their exploited victims, they are the disloyalists and the traitors. If this be true, I want to take my side by side with the traitors in this fight. Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder. In the Middle Ages, when the feudal lords who inhabited the castles whose towers may still be seen along the Rhine concluded to enlarge their domains, to increase their power, their prestige, and their wealth, they declared war upon one another. But they themselves did not go to war any more than the modern feudal lords, the barons of Wall Street, go to war. The feudal barons of the Middle Ages, the economic predecessors of the capitalists of our day, declared all wars. And their miserable serfs fought all the battles. The poor, ignorant serfs had been taught to revere their masters, to believe that when their masters declared war upon one another, it was their patriotic duty to fall upon one another and to cut one another's throats for the profit and glory of the lords and barons who held them in contempt. And that is war in a nutshell. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives. They've always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. Yours, not to reason why. Yours, but to do and die. That is their motto, and we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation. If war is right, let it be declared by the people. You who have your lives to lose, you certainly, above all others, have the right to decide the momentous issue of war and peace.
On November 11th, 1918, World War I ended. 10 million people were dead, including more than 100,000 Americans. Disillusionment quickly set in and was reflected in a burst of anti-war literature, as in the poems of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Ernest Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, and Ford Madox Ford's No More Parades. The rebellious and anti-authoritarian poet E.E. Cummings, who served in an ambulance group in France during World War I, here writes of a conscientious objector to the war.
I sing of Olaf, glad and big, whose warmest heart recoiled at war, a conscientious objector. His well-beloved Colonel Trigg, West Pointer most succinctly bred, took erring Olaf soon in hand. But though an honest of overjoyed non-coms, first knocking on the head him do through icy waters roll, that helplessness which others stroke with brushes recently employed anent this muddy toilet bowl, while kindred intellects evoke allegiance per blunt instruments. Olaf being to all intents a corpse, and wanting any rag upon which God unto him gave, responds without getting annoyed, I will not kiss your fucking flag. Straightway the silver blurred looked grave, departing rapidly to shave. But though all kinds of officers, a yearning nation's blue-eyed pride, their passive prey did kick and curse, until for wear their clarion voices and boots were much the worse, and egged the first-class privates on, his rectum wickedly to tease by means of skillfully applied bayonets roasted hot with heat. Olaf, upon what once were knees, does almost ceaselessly repeat, there is some shit I will not eat. Our president, being of which a citizen's duly notified, threw the yellow son of a bitch into a dungeon, where he died. Christ, of his mercy infinite, I wish to see, and Olaf too, preponderatingly because, unless statistics lie, he was more brave than me, more blonde than you.
In the 1930s, Sylvia Woods was a pioneer in a struggle of African-American trade unionists. Here she describes her earliest experiences speaking out against racism.
When I was maybe 10 years old, I changed schools. On the way to school, I had to go through a park that was for white people only. There were swings in this park, and I so much wanted sometimes just to stop and swing a little while, but we couldn't because we were black. I would walk through this park to my school, where there weren't any swings. Every morning, all the kids would line up according to classrooms, and we would have prayers and sing the Star-Spangled Banner. One day, I decided I wasn't going to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. I just stood there every morning, and I didn't sing it. One of the teachers noticed that I wasn't doing it, so she very quietly called me over and asked me why I didn't sing the Star-Spangled Banner. I said I just didn't feel like singing it. So she said, well, then you have to go into the principal and explain that to him. All of the children in the school take part, and you've got to do so too. Okay. I went into the principal, and he asked me why I wasn't singing the Star-Spangled Banner. I told him, because it says the land of the free and the home of the brave, and this is not the land of the free. I don't know who's brave, but I'm not going to sing it anymore. Then he said, why, you've been singing it all the time, haven't you? How come you want to stop now? And I told him about coming through the park, and if I could not swing on those swings in the park, and if I couldn't sit in the park, and I could only walk in Shakespeare Park, then it couldn't be the land of the free. Who's free? He didn't say anything. Then he said, well, you could pledge your allegiance to your flag. I said, it's not my flag. The flag is with freedom. If the land is free and the flag is mine, then how come I can't do like the white kids do.
The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s produced an extraordinary group of black writers and artists. There were the novelists Zora Neale Hurston and Nella Larson, the painters Jacob Lawrence and Aaron Douglas, the poets Gwendolyn Bennett, Claude McKay, and County Cullen, among many others. One of the most challenging of these voices was that of Langston Hughes, who in this poem captures the feeling of being damn tired of waiting for rescue from the political leadership of the country.
The pot was empty, the cupboard was bare. I said, "Papa, what's the matter here?" "I'm waiting on Roosevelt, son." "Roosevelt?" "Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt, son." The rent was due and the light was out. I said, "Tell me, Mama, what's it all about?" "We're waiting on Roosevelt, son." "Roosevelt?" "Roosevelt, just waiting on Roosevelt." Sister got sick and the doctor wouldn't come because we couldn't pay him the proper sum. Waiting on Roosevelt. Roosevelt, Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt. Then one day they put us out of the house. Ma and Pa was meek as a mouse, still waiting on Roosevelt. Roosevelt, Roosevelt. But when they felt those cold winds blow and didn't have no place to go, Pa said, "I'm tired of waiting on Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. Damn tired of waiting on Roosevelt. Can't get a job, and I can't get no grub. Backbone and navel's doing the belly rub. Waiting on Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Roosevelt." And a lot of other folks what's hungry and cold done stop believing what they've been told by Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. Because the pot's still empty and the cupboard's still bare, and you can't build a bungalow out of air. Mr. Roosevelt, listen, what's the matter here?
The Japanese-American civil rights activist, feminist, author, Yuri Kochiyama was born and raised in San Pedro, California. She and her family were among the 120,000 Japanese-Americans on the West Coast who were rounded up in a wave of anti-Japanese hysteria that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, giving the Army the power, without warrants, indictments, or hearings, to arrest all Japanese Americans, 3/4 of them children born in the United States and therefore citizens, take them from their homes, transport them to camps far in the interior, and keep them there under prison conditions. The Supreme Court upheld this on grounds of military necessity. Not until the 1980s did the federal courts concede that a wrong had been committed. Yuri Kochiyama describes here the conditions in the detention camps.
I was red, white, and blue when I was growing up. I taught Sunday school and was very, very American. We were just kids rooting for our high school. I was 19 at the time of evacuation, and I had just finished junior college. I was looking for a job and didn't realize how different the school world was from the work world. In the school world, I never felt racism, but when you got into the work world, it was very difficult. This was 1941, just before the war. I finally did get a job at a department store, but for us back then, it was a big thing, because I don't think they had ever hired an Asian in a department store before. Well, I tried because I saw a Mexican friend who got a job there, but everything changed for me on the day Pearl Harbor was bombed. On that very day, December 7th, the FBI came and they took my father. He had just come home from the hospital the day before. And for several days, we didn't know where they had taken him. And then we found out that he was taken to the federal prison at Terminal Island. Overnight, things changed for us. Most Japanese Americans had to give up their jobs, whatever they did, and were told they had to leave. The edict for 9066, President Roosevelt's edict for evacuation, was in February 1942. We were moved to a detention center that April. We were sent to an assembly center in Arcadia, California. That was in April. And it was the largest assembly center on the West Coast, having nearly 20,000 people. There were some smaller centers with about 600 people all along the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California. There were many, many assembly centers, but ours was the largest. Most of the assembly centers were either fairgrounds or racetracks. So many of us lived in stables, and they said you could take what you could carry. I was so red, white, and blue. I couldn't believe this was happening to us. America would never do a thing like this to us. This is the greatest country in the world. So I thought this is only going to be for a short while, maybe a few weeks or something, and they'll let us go back. At the beginning, no one realized how long this would go on. I didn't feel the anger that much because I thought maybe this was the way we could show our love for our country, and we should not make too much fuss or noise. We should abide by what they asked of us. I'm a totally different person now than I was back then. I was naive about so many things. And the more I think about it, the more I realize how little you learn about American history. It's just what they want you to know. We always called the camps relocation centers while we were there. Now, I feel it is apropos to call them concentration camps. It is not the same as the concentration camps of Europe. Those, we feel, were death camps. The concentration camps were a concentration of people placed in an area and disempowered and disenfranchised. So it is apropos to call them what I was in, a concentration camp. Historically, Americans have always been putting people behind walls. First, there were the Native Americans who were put on reservations, Africans in slavery, their lives on the plantations, Chicanos doing migratory work and the kinds of camps they lived in, and even, too, the Chinese when they worked on the railroad camps, where they were almost isolated, dispossessed people, disempowered. And I feel those are the things we should fight against so they won't happen again. This whole period of what the Japanese went through is important. If we can see the connections of how often this happens in history, we can stem the tide of these things happening again by speaking out against them.
At the end of World War II, HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, set up in 1938 to investigate subversive activity in the United States, called before it Hollywood writers, actors, and directors, presumably to find evidence of communist influence in the movie industry. A number of these artists, who became known as the Hollywood 10, were sent to prison for refusing to answer the committee's questions about their ties with the Communist Party. The committee also interrogated folk singer Pete Singer, playwright Arthur Miller, and many others. This was part of a general attack on civil liberties in the atmosphere of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. One of the artists singled out for attack was the great singer and actor Paul Robeson, who had been a fierce opponent of racism and the foreign policy of the United States. Here is a statement Robeson intended to present before HUAC, but which he was not allowed to read.
A footnote to history before I begin. It so happens in the book, my father's piece immediately follows that of Yuri Kochiyama. That's, in a sense, symbolic, because Paul Robeson, then a national star, most popular singer and actor in the United States, was the only major performing artist, indeed the only major public figure, to sing a benefit concert for the interned Japanese during the war. 15 years later, denied a passport. He himself was, in a sense, under house arrest in his own land. The State Department claims the right to deny me a passport because of what they called my recognized status as a spokesman for large sections of Negro Americans, and because I have been for years extremely active in behalf of the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa. The State Department has also based its denial of a passport to me on the fact that I sent a message of greeting to the Bandung Conference, convened by Nehru, Sukarno, and other great leaders of the colored peoples of the world. Principally, however, Dulles objects to speeches I have made abroad against the oppression suffered by my own people in the United States. I am proud that those statements can be made about me. It is my firm intention to continue to speak out against injustices to the Negro people, and I shall continue to do all within my power in behalf of independence of colonial peoples of Africa. It is for Dulles to explain why a Negro who opposes colonialism and supports the aspirations of Negro Americans should, for those reasons, be denied a passport. My fight for a passport is a struggle for freedom, freedom to travel, freedom to earn a livelihood, freedom to speak, freedom to express myself artistically and culturally. I've been denied these freedoms because Dulles, Eastland, Walter, and their ilk oppose my views on colonial liberation, my resistance to the oppression of Negro Americans, and my burning desire for peace with all nations. But these are views which I shall proclaim whenever given the opportunity, whether before this committee or any other body. My travels abroad to sing and act and speak cannot possibly harm the American people. In the past, I have won friends for the real America among the millions before whom I have performed. Not for Walter, not for Dulles, not for Eastland, not for the racists who disgrace our country's name, but friends for the American Negro, for our workers, for our farmers, for our artists. By continuing the struggle at home and abroad for peace and friendship with all of the world's people, for an end to colonialism, and for full citizenship for Negro Americans, and for a world in which art and culture may abound. I intend to continue to win friends for the best in American life.
In Macomb, Mississippi, in July of 1965, young black activists circulated and published one of the first petitions against the war in Vietnam.
Here are 5 reasons why Negroes should not be in any war fighting for America. 1, no Mississippi Negroes should be fighting in Vietnam for the white man's freedom until all the Negro people are free in Mississippi. 2, Negro boys should not honor the draft here in Mississippi. Mothers should encourage their sons not to go. 3, we will gain respect and dignity as a race only by forcing the U.S. government and the Mississippi government to come with guns, dogs, and trucks to take our sons away to fight and to be killed. 4, no one has a right to ask us to risk our lives and kill other colored people in Vietnam so that the white American can get richer. We will be looked upon as traitors by all colored people of the world if the Negro people continue to fight and die without a cause. 5, last week a white soldier from New Jersey was discharged from the Army because he refused to fight in Vietnam. He went on a hunger strike. Negro boys can do the same thing. We can write and ask our sons if they know what they are fighting for. If he answers freedom, tell him that's what we're fighting for here in Mississippi. If he says democracy, tell him the truth. We don't know anything about communism, socialism, and all that. But we do know that Negroes have caught hell right here under this American democracy.
In November 1970, Howard Zinn was arrested with others in a protest at a Boston Army base to block soldiers from being sent to Vietnam. On the day he was supposed to appear in court, he was also scheduled to go to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, to debate the philosopher Charles Frankel on the topic of civil disobedience. He chose to defy the court order to both explain and practice his commitment to civil disobedience. He flew to Baltimore, spoke in the debate, and came back to Boston to teach his class the next morning at Boston University. 2 detectives were waiting outside the classroom and hauled him off to court, where he was sentenced to a few days in jail. Here is the text of Howard's speech at Johns Hopkins.
I start from the supposition that the world is topsy-turvy, that things are all wrong, that the wrong people are in jail and the wrong people are out of jail, that the wrong people are in power and the wrong people are out of power. that the wealth is distributed in this country and the world in such a way as not simply to require small reform, but to require a drastic reallocation of wealth. I start from the supposition that we don't have to say too much about this, because all we have to do is think about the state of the world today and realize that things are all upside down. Daniel Berrigan is in jail, a Catholic priest, a poet who opposes the war. And J. Edgar Hoover is free, you see. David Dellinger, who has opposed war ever since he was this high and has used all of his energy and passion against it, is in danger of going to jail. The men who are responsible for the My Lai massacre are not on trial. They are in Washington serving various functions, primary and subordinate, that have to do with the unleashing of massacres, which surprise them when they occur. At Kent State University, 4 students were killed by the National Guard, and students were indicted. In every city in this country, when demonstrations take place, the protesters, whether they have demonstrated or not, whatever they have done, are assaulted and clubbed by police, and then they are arrested for assaulting a police officer. Something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong when we ship 10,000 bombs full of nerve gas across the country and drop them in somebody else's swimming pool so as not to trouble our own. So you lose your perspective after a while. If you don't think, if you just listen to TV and read scholarly things, you actually begin to think that things are not so bad, or that just little things are wrong. But you have to get a little detached and then come back and look at the world, and you are horrified. So we have to start from that supposition that things are really topsy-turvy. And our topic is topsy-turvy, civil disobedience. As soon as you say the topic is civil disobedience, you're saying our problem is civil disobedience. That is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is the numbers of people all over the world who have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. We recognize this for Nazi Germany. We know that the problem there was obedience, that the people obeyed Hitler. People obeyed. That was wrong. They should have challenged. They should have resisted. And if we were only there, we would have showed them. Even in Stalin's Russia, we can understand that. People are obedient, all these herd-like people. Remember those bad old days when people were exploited by feudalism? Everything was terrible in the Middle Ages. But now we have Western civilization, the rule of law. The rule of law has regularized and maximized the injustice that existed before the rule of law. That is what the rule of law has done. When in all the nations of the world, the rule of law is the darling of the leaders and the plague of the people, we ought to begin to recognize this. We have to transcend these national boundaries in our thinking. Nixon and Brezhnev have much more in common with one another than we have with Nixon. J. Edgar Hoover has far more in common with the head of the Soviet secret police than he has with us. It's the international dedication to law and order that binds the leaders of all countries in a comradely bond. That's why we're always surprised when they get together. They smile, they shake hands, they smoke cigars. They really like one another, no matter what they say. Yossarian was right. Remember in Catch-22? He'd been accused of giving aid and comfort to the enemy, which nobody should ever be accused of. And Yossarian said to his friend Clevenger, The enemy is whoever is going to get you killed, whichever side they're on. And we must remember that our enemies are not divided along national lines, that enemies are not just people who speak different languages and occupy different territories. Enemies are people who want to get us killed. The law is the Bill of Rights. In fact, that's what we think of when we develop our reverence for the law. So you have to be careful when you say, I'm for the law, I revere the law. What part of the law are you talking about? I'm not against all law, but I think we ought to begin to make very important distinctions about what laws do what things to what people. What we are trying to do, I assume, is really to get back to the principles and aims and spirit of the Declaration of Independence. This spirit is resistance to illegitimate authority and to forces that deprive people of their life and liberty and right to pursue happiness. And therefore, under these conditions, it urges the right to alter or abolish their current form of government. And the stress had been on abolish. But to establish the principles of the Declaration of Independence, we are going to need to go outside the law, to stop obeying the laws that demand killing, or that allocate wealth the way it has been done, or that put people in jail for petty technical offenses and keep other people out of jail for enormous crimes. My hope is that this kind of spirit will take place not just in this country, but in other countries, because they all need it. People in all countries need the spirit of disobedience to the state. The state, which is not a metaphysical thing, but a thing of force and wealth. And we need a kind of declaration of interdependence among people in all countries of the world who are striving for the same thing.
Delivered it a lot better than I did. Yeah. I guess, maybe I'm going. It's my turn. I'm so wrapped up in myself. Yeah, on August 28th, 1963, the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom brought more than 200,000 demonstrators to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to fight for civil rights. While that event is best remembered for being the occasion of Martin Luther King Jr.'s historic I Have a Dream speech, the most militant address of the day was delivered by John Lewis of Alabama, a young leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. However, pressured by King and other established civil rights leaders, Lewis was forced to tone down the text, which spoke of revolution, which argued that President John F. Kennedy's proposed civil rights legislation was too little, too late. Here's the text of the original speech he had hoped to deliver that day.
We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. For hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here. They have no money for their transportation. for they are receiving starvation wages, or no wages at all. In good conscience, we cannot support the administration's civil rights bill, for it is too little and too late. There's not one thing in the bill that will protect our people from police brutality. This bill will not protect young children and old women from police dogs and fire hoses. The voting section of this bill will not help thousands of black citizens who want to vote. It will not help the citizens of Mississippi, of Alabama, and Georgia who are qualified to vote but lack a sixth-grade education. We are now involved in revolution. This nation is still a place of cheap political leaders who build their careers on immoral compromise and ally themselves with open forms of political and economic exploitation. What political party here can stand up and say, my party is the party of principles? The party of Kennedy is also the party of Eastland. The party of Chavez is also the party of Goldwater. Where's our party? The revolution is at hand, and we must free ourselves of the chains of political and economic slavery. The nonviolent revolution is saying we will not wait for the courts to act, for we have been waiting for hundreds of years. We will not wait for the president, the Justice Department, nor Congress. We will take matters into our own hands and create a source of power outside any national structure that could and would assure us victory. To those who have said, be patient and wait, we must say that patience is a dirty and nasty word. We cannot be patient. We do not want to be free gradually. We want our freedom, and we want it now. We cannot depend on any political party, for both the Democrats and Republicans have betrayed the basic principles of the Declaration of Independence. We all recognize that if any radical social, political, and economic changes are to take place in our society, the people, the masses, must bring them about. In the struggle, we must seek more than civil rights. We must work for the community of love, peace, and true brotherhood. Our minds, souls, and hearts cannot rest until freedom and justice exist for all the people. The revolution is a serious one. Mr. Kennedy is trying to take the revolution out of the street and put it in the courts. Listen, Mr. Kennedy. Listen, Mr. Congressman. Listen, fellow citizens. The black masses are on the march for jobs and freedom, and we must say to the politicians that there won't be a cooling off period. We won't stop now. All the forces of Eastland, Barnett, Wallace, and Thurman won't stop this revolution. The time will come when we will not confine our marching to Washington. We will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. We shall pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground, nonviolently. We shall fragment the South into 1,000 pieces and put them back together in the image of democracy. We will make the actions of the past few months look petty. And I say to you, wake up, America.
At great personal risk to themselves, black people in the South had for a long time challenged the boundaries of segregation. But those many actions did not come to national attention until in December 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested when she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. This sparked a bus boycott that lasted 381 days before ending in a victory. A few years after that, students began a campaign to desegregate lunch counters in the South. One of the most important of these sit-ins took place on May 23, 1963, in Jackson, Mississippi, at a Woolworth's department store. Here, the civil rights activist Anne Moody recalls the experience.
At exactly 11 a.m., Perlina, Memphis, and I entered the Woolworths from the rear entrance. We separated as soon as we stepped into the store and made small purchases from various counters. Seconds before 11:15, we were occupying 3 seats at the previously segregated Woolworth's lunch counter. Our waitress walked past us a couple of times before she noticed we had started to write our own orders. She told us that we would be served at the back counter, which was for Negroes. "We would like to be served here," I said. At noon, students from a nearby white school started pouring into Woolworth's. The white students started chanting all kinds of anti-Negro slogans. A couple of boys took one end of a rope and made it into a hangman's noose. Several attempts were made to put it around our necks. I was snatched from my stool by 2 high school students. I was dragged about 30 feet toward the door by my hair when someone made them turn me loose. As I was getting up off the floor, I saw Joan coming back inside. We started back to the center of the counter to join Perlina. Lois Chafee, a white Tougaloo faculty member, was now sitting next to her. There were now 4 of us, 2 whites and 2 Negroes, all women. The mob started smearing us with ketchup, mustards, sugar, pies. Soon Joan and I were joined by John Salter, but the moment he sat down, he was hit in the jaw with what appeared to be brass knuckles. Blood gushed from his face, and someone threw salt into the open wound. Joan, Lois, Perlina, and I sat there for 3 hours. About 90 policemen were standing outside the store. They had been watching the whole thing through the windows, but had not come in to stop the mob or do anything. After the sit-in, all I could think of was how sick Mississippi whites were. They believed so much in the segregated Southern way of life, they would kill to preserve it. I thought of how many times they had killed when their way of life was threatened. I knew that the killing had just begun. The whites had a disease, an incurable disease, in its final stage.
The history of AIDS has been one of denial and suppression, because those most immediately affected by the disease in its early years were gays and lesbians, often people of color and drug users. President Ronald Reagan did not make public mention of the epidemic until October 1987. People with HIV and AIDS and public health advocates have had to battle for recognition of the disease, for affordable and effective treatment, for public education and health programs to prevent the spread of HIV. March 1987 saw the formation of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, in New York. The group popularized the slogan, "Silence equals death," and engaged in direct action and civil disobedience to arouse the public. Here are the words of Vito Russo, the author of a groundbreaking book called The Celluloid Closet, and a founding member of ACT. Russo himself died as a result of AIDS in 1990, aged 44.
A friend of mine in New York City has a half-fare transit card, which means that you get on buses and subways for half price. And the other day, when he showed his card to the token attendant, the attendant asked what his disability was, and he said, "I have AIDS." And the attendant said, "No, you don't. If you had AIDS, you'd be home dying." And so I wanted to speak out today as a person with AIDS who is not dying. You know, for the last 3 years since I was diagnosed, my family thinks two things about my situation. One, they think I'm going to die. And two, they think that my government is doing absolutely everything in their power to stop that. And they're wrong on both counts. So, if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from homophobia. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape, because these are the things that are preventing an end to this crisis. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from Jesse Helms. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the President of the United States. And especially if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the sensationalism of newspapers and magazines and television shows, which are interested in me as a human interest story, only as long as I'm willing to be a helpless victim, but not if I'm fighting for my life. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the fact that not enough rich, white, heterosexual men have gotten AIDS for anybody to give a shit. You know, living with AIDS in this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war which is happening only for those people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around, you discover that you've lost more of your friends, but nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of nightmare. And all the time, only you can hear the screams of the people who are dying and their cries for help. No one else seems to be noticing. Someday the AIDS crisis will be over. Remember that. And when that day comes, when that day has come and gone, there'll be people alive on this earth, gay people and straight people, men and women, black and white, who will hear the story that once there was a terrible disease in this country and all over the world, and that a brave group of people stood up and fought, and in some cases gave their lives so that other people might live. And we have to commit ourselves to doing that. And then after we kick the shit out of this disease, we're all going to be alive to kick the shit out of this system so that this never happens again.
Immediately after the tragic deaths of 3,000 people on September 11th, 2001, President George Bush and other politicians called for retaliation. It was soon clear that Afghanistan would be their target, even though a majority of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and there was no clear evidence linking the government of Afghanistan to the attacks. There was widespread grief in the United States, but a number of family members who lost loved ones on September 11th spoke out against the calls for revenge and formed an organization called September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. 4 days after the hijackings, Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, whose son Gregory, 31 years old, was killed while working on the 103rd floor of the World Trade Center, sent this open letter to the New York Times.
Our son, Greg, is among the many missing from the World Trade Center attack. Since we first heard the news, we have shared moments of grief, comfort, hope, despair, fond memories with his wife, the two families, our friends and neighbors, his loving colleagues at Cantor Fitzgerald ESB, and all the grieving families that daily meet at the Pierre Hotel. We see our hurt and anger reflected among everybody we meet. We cannot pay attention to the daily flow of news about this disaster, but we read enough of the news to sense that our government is heading in the direction of violent revenge, with the prospect of sons, daughters, parents, friends in distant lands dying, suffering, and nursing further grievances against us. It is not the way to go. It will not avenge our son's death, not in our son's name. Our son died a victim of an inhuman ideology. We should not serve the same purpose. Let us grieve, let us reflect and pray. Let us think about a rational response that brings real peace and justice to our world. But let us not, as a nation, add to the inhumanity of our times.
Thank all of you for coming. I want to give special thanks to Anthony Arnove, probably more responsible than anybody else, for just making sure that all of this happened, aside from the fact that he worked very hard. I don't want to say who worked harder on the book. He worked very hard. You see. Anthony Arnove. Okay. And and these wonderful people in the arts who gave their time tonight to read. Wally Shawn, Leslie Silva, Brian Jones, John Sayles, Sarah Jones, Paul Robeson, Lily Taylor. Thank you.